Hi everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's session. So I'm Dr. Alba O'Loughlin, and I'm from the York Law School here at the University of York. And I'm really pleased to be chairing this session on rebuilding policing and public trust today. We have a great range of speakers with a great range of expertise in this area, and we're going to examine the challenges to public confidence in the police. And it's often said that policing really rests on a contract between the population and the police that rests on public trust and confidence in the police, and that in the UK we have a model of policing by consent. And we're going to look at some of the areas in which that kind of contract can start to become undermined. So particularly when we look at the range of scandals and investigations and inquiries that we've seen in recent years, but also sort of more long-standing challenges as well to policing, including sort of a more long-standing challenge around transparency and fairness and equality in policing as well. And today's panel, so like the previous panel this afternoon as well, we're grateful to the Morrell Centre for Legal and Political Philosophy, who has generously supported today's events on criminal justice. So it's my great pleasure then to welcome our fantastic expert panel, who's each going to contribute their thoughts. So we're going to kind of go in order that they're seated here. So I'm just going to introduce each speaker, tell you a bit about their background and their expertise, and then each speaker will speak for about 7 minutes. And then we'll have a panel discussion. So I'll ask the speakers some questions. They might ask each other some questions as well. And then we'll call on questions from the audience. And there's going to be roving mics. So if you want to ask a question in that question and answer session, then we'll get the microphones over to you. So I'll introduce the speakers then. So beside me, we've got Miran Gidda, who's an investigative journalist with Liberty Investigates, which is an independent journalism unit based at the human rights organisation Liberty. And Miran helped to found the unit in 2019. And she's reported extensively on the criminal justice system, particularly policing, and she recently exposed the serious ethnic disproportionality in the police's coronavirus fines and gave evidence to the Home Affairs Select Committee. Then next to Miran we have Professor Ben Bradford, and he's the Professor of Global City Policing at the Jill Dando Institute of Security and Crime Science at University College London. And he's also the director of the Centre for Global City Policing. And he has published extensively on organisational justice within police agencies, ethnic and other disparities in policing, including stop and search and other elements of public-facing police work, such as neighbourhood patrols and neighbourhood patrols and community engagement. We talked about parole earlier, so I'm tripping over my words. And then next to Ben, then we have Dr. Justice Tankebe, who's an Associate Professor of Criminology at the University of Cambridge, and he's the Deputy Director of the Institute of Criminology there. And his research concerns police legitimacy, police community relations, violence and corruption. And then last then we have Dr. Sam Fowles. He's a barrister specialising in public and constitutional law, and he has experience of law in the UK, the US, Australia, and at the Council of Europe. And he's worked on many of the most significant political cases of recent years and regularly appears in the media, including on the BBC, Sky, and Al Jazeera. So without further ado then, we'll move on to the panel discussion. So Miran, if you'd like to start us off.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. It can be quite daunting as a journalist to have to talk about the root causes of anything, particularly public mistrust in the police, not least because I think our reporting is often the reason why there is public mistrust in the police. So instead, I thought it'd be helpful if I gave you an overview of what we've uncovered at Liberty Investigates and the difficulties we faced in reporting on the police and ensuring public scrutiny of police forces. So as Alva said, we set up Liberty Investigates in 2019, right before the pandemic took hold. And I think it was a really interesting time to be setting up an investigative unit that had as its goal, to report on the police and to expose police disproportionality. And by early 2020, as all of you will remember, we began to see legislation being pushed through that granted the police quite sweeping powers. So that's the Coronavirus Act and then the coronavirus regulations. And obviously, we've kind of seen that continue with the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act and the Public Order Act. And it felt like we were in this quite volatile situation where the police were getting these widespread powers in an emergency context, where public scrutiny was a lot less because we were locked down. And there was a feeling, I think, among some people that harsher policing was justifiable because of the fact that we were in a pandemic. And at the time, the concern that a lot of police monitoring groups had was that these new powers could worsen existing disproportionalities because there weren't really sufficient safeguards in place. And officers were wielding the new powers, and that included the ability to give fines to people for breaking lockdown rules for the first time. So once the police began issuing the lockdown fines, it seemed like monitoring groups' fears were coming true. You might remember some stories came out of people being improperly and unfairly fined, but we didn't really have a sense of whether this was widespread or how big of an issue it was. So what we did to get that overview was requested under the Freedom of Information Act the fines data broken down by ethnicity, and we got that first for the whole of England and then by individual police forces. And the data showed serious ethnic disproportionality. So we found that black and minority ethnic people were 54% more likely to be fined than white people across the whole of England. And then the greatest disproportionality was actually seen in Cumbria, where BAME people were 6.8 times more likely to be fined than white people. And I think it was at this point that it became clear to us at Liberty Investigates that police data as a whole was really something worth looking into, and that's so we could get that fuller picture of how forces were operating and how they were using different powers. And speaking personally, it's the first time that I'd used data in my reporting like this, but it's something that we have continued to do. So since then, we've obtained and published data on police use of force, use of counter-terrorism powers, and the use of strip searches against children. And what the data has shown with all of these stories is that disproportionality, ethnic disproportionality that is, has run throughout police deployment of these powers. And as I'm sure you've gathered, they are quite varied powers, but they are powers that can have life-threatening or life-altering consequences. And obviously, Liberty Investigates are not the only journalists doing this work. In the last few years, as I'm sure the other panellists will cover, there's been a real increase, I think, in public, political, legal, and journalistic scrutiny of the police, and in particular the Met. And I think what we've seen as well is that some forces, as a consequence of this, have begun issuing apologies for past behaviours and promising greater accountability and transparency. I think the issue is that that's not what we, and I'm using we as in journalists, are seeing in practice. And I thought I would share with you some of the difficulties that we face when we are reporting on the police and trying to raise this public awareness of what's going on. So the first point to make is that it's still extraordinarily difficult sometimes to get information from the police. We at LI use FOI a lot, and it's very common for our responses to be delayed or to be outright refused. And I don't know how well you know FOI, but it's 20 working days to get a response. It's rare that that deadline is met, and the police can rely on a number of exemptions to refuse that information. We can, and we do, often challenge refusals to the Information Commissioner's Office, but that understandably drags out the process even more. And there is quite a bad backlog at the moment with the ICO, which means that stories that we have can take months to come to fruition just because of this. And we also know, and this is from submitting subject access requests and what are known as meta FOIs, which I won't go into, that when forces have got FOI requests from us, the National Police Chiefs Council often gives them a centralised response to issue us with, which basically means that forces that might have been willing to hand over the information don't because of what they've been told by the NPCC. And we also know that the Met flags FOI requests from journalists, which, at least to me, does kind of prompt the question as, if they're flagging it, what does that mean in terms of how they draft the responses? So that's the first issue. It's difficult. The second is that when we do get the data, it can often be quite poor. And one major issue that I've noticed is the recording of ethnicity. So I've had returns where there's a very large number of people where ethnicity has not been recorded, or where it's only the officer who's recorded ethnicity, so that's their perception of this person's ethnicity, it's not what the person themselves has said. And obviously this prevents a clear understanding of what's going on. And this has happened where I've got a return where, say, a quarter of the people, it says ethnicity is not known. And for accuracy, we just take them out of the data set. If you imagine that 3/4 of those were people of colour, that really does skew an understanding of like what is actually going on. And then another issue with the data is that there isn't uniformity among the forces in how they record data, which makes cross-comparison really difficult. And cross-comparison is important because when you look at something like lockdown fines or strip search, it's useful to know where the worst disproportionality is, because then you can identify where the biggest problems are. And the lack of cross-comparison can be because forces either record different things or they use different measures for it. And the fact that the data is held separately by individual forces means that for us as journalists, if we want to get the national picture, we have to submit 43 individual FOIs, so that's to all the police forces. We have to chase them, monitor the responses, and then try and put them all into a spreadsheet. And that is, I'm not asking for sympathy, but it is a huge amount of work. And while the Home Office does centralise some data, notably on stop and search, that's quite good, it's not happening across the board. And the third and final issue is that when we do publish our articles, it's sometimes felt like there is an unwillingness among forces to accept accountability. So back when we reported on the lockdown fines, the NPCC cast doubt on the accuracy of our data analysis and said that they didn't feel meaningful conclusions could be drawn, and they asked me to hold off on publishing so they could do their own analysis, which I didn't do. But earlier this year, a report that the NPCC commissioned into the fines found similar findings to ours, which obviously disproved their earlier concerns. And similarly, when I recently reported on Met strip searches of children, the force did say it made mistakes and it was going to try and use strip searches less. But if you remember the Child Q case, which happened in 2020, what the data showed is that in the 3 years, 2017 to 2020, the same number of female children and teenagers had been strip searched as in the years after, so 2020 to 2022. Which it might be that the Met's going to wind down the use of strip search now, but it's given that Child Q was such a reckoning, I thought that was interesting. And just to kind of wrap up, I hope I haven't gone over, as a journalist, I do kind of shy away from trying to give big conclusions as to what should happen next or what needs to change. But what I would say is that first, then urgently, needs to be better and more centralised recording of data by police forces. And the ethnicity data needs to be collected as a matter of course. Second, I think where journalists are doing the work to uncover and expose disproportionality, there needs to be a commitment by the police to take that work further and identify what the causes are and how they can be addressed, instead of trying to explain the data away, which is what we often experience. So yeah, that's my 7 minutes. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Ken, for the invite to come and talk today. If it makes you feel any better, there's no reason why it should, those are exactly the same issues we face as academics. And actually, a challenge for any academics in the room, I would suggest that some of the best work on these issues and more widely around policing in the last 10 or 15 years has been done by journalists and not academics. I'm thinking about the work on undercover policing, for example. We share a lot of those issues. So I thought what I would do in my 7 minutes, I don't know if I'll talk for 7 minutes, is just zoom out a bit and look at the big picture here, which I guess is the reason why we're all here today, which is the decline in trust and confidence in policing. Let's say in England and Wales, the fact that we live in a jurisdictional anarchy makes it quite difficult to talk about this stuff, but let's imagine we're talking about England and Wales. And it certainly has gone down. So if anyone is interested, you can look at Mayor's Office of Policing and Crime, London MOPAC, their confidence dashboard, I think it's still called. confidence dashboard, where they've got lots of indicators from the survey they've run in the capital for 10, 15, 20 years now. And on all these indicators, all the lines on their dashboard are all heading down like this, some really, really quite dramatically. And I don't think it's out of the question to use words such as a collapse in trust and confidence, or something like, trust and confidence in the police has fallen off a cliff. I think we're almost in that kind of realm, which is historically quite unusual. I mean, the longer history here is we generally think that trust in the police in England and Wales declined from the 1960s onwards to about 2000, around that kind of time, and actually from 2000 went up, kind of crept up for a number of years, and then recently in the last period of time we've seen this really quite radical switch in that and the declines I've discussed. And when we think about the reasons for that decline, we tend to reach for the kinds of things that we've already mentioned, I think. But probably the paradigmatic example is the Sarah Everard case. And I really do think that crystallised a whole set of concerns that people may not have even been aware they had around policing. It's one of these kind of signal events that may change the way that people think about an institution. But in the same breath, we'll often talk about things like George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter, the 2020 iteration of that, which again, kind of on a global basis actually, may have had similar kinds of effects. And most recently, of course, the Casey report, which if anyone hasn't read, I really recommend that you go and have a look at in terms of what we're talking about here today. The issue with that story is, and I think that is a really important story, and as I say, I think the Sarah Everard case in particular, it is this kind of signal crystallising event. The issue with that story is if you look at the MOPAC dashboard and you look at some of the other evidence we have around what has happened to public trust in police, the decline actually started before then. The decline started 2016, 2017, 2018, when we weren't having these kinds of debates, or not, at least not nearly to the same extent. And it's also the case, I mean, I think you're right, I think there is greater investigation, let's say, of police malfeasance than there has been for a number of years. But it's always been the case that policing is scandalous. There have always been very, very significant scandals around policing from the 1970s onwards. We could talk about the miners' strike, we could talk about the Stephen Lawrence case, we could talk about the Thurston Review, we could talk about the Brixton riots. So there's a whole set of these things. And they haven't necessarily had the effects that the recent events have had. And why is that the case? And I think one of the most important reasons why we are where we are is a slightly longer story that starts in 2010 with austerity, when the government changed in response to the financial crisis. Police budgets were cut very significantly. This was almost unheard of. Police organisations were not used to having their budgets cut. They didn't really know how to deal with it. There was a significant decline in police numbers. There was withdrawal from policies such as neighbourhood policing, community policing, whatever you want to call it. People experienced this as a withdrawal of policing from their communities. They weren't getting the kind of policing they want. When you talk to people about what they want from policing, almost invariably, top of their list will be visibility in their community, community engagement, talking to people, understanding what our problems are, acting on our problems in this area. Those kinds of questions. People felt and continue to feel that that's gone. And a large part of that reason that has gone is because of the decline in numbers and a refocusing of policing. And there's some other quite interesting elements to this story, I think. So one of the recent developments in policing, and it's partly a response to austerity, has been growth in what's called the evidence-based policing, and I'll call it a movement, because it kind of is a movement, within academia and within policing. Evidence-based policing is all about getting the most effective policies in place to reduce crime, essentially. What that means is it directs policing in a particular set of ways that aren't necessarily the ways that the public, whoever they are, want policing to go. So a great example here is burglary. So the evidence-based policing approach to burglary is that you don't need to send police officers to burglaries. You may send police staff to investigate. You may just ask people to report it and record it, because you're not going to catch anyone there. You're extremely unlikely to catch a burglar as a result from one burglary. You need to gather intelligence across the piece, etc., etc. That's not what people who've been burgled want from the police. People who've been burgled want the police to come and look like they give a damn what happened to them. And there's a whole range of such examples that have kind of increasing or have increased the distance between the police and the communities they serve. And interestingly enough, I think the police have now realised this, and at the end of last year they said we now are going to send police officers to every burglary, so that they've changed their mind in that extent. So I think this change from about 2010 onwards, to change in the structural policing, the structural conditions, the structural context of policing really primed people. So when events such as Sarah Everard occurred, people latched onto them because they told them a story that they understood and they recognised. The police don't care about communities, they're absent, they're looking in the wrong kind of places, they're doing the wrong kind of things. I think there's a couple of provisos I might want to give here, but which I think may lead into some of the things that Justice might want to say. The first is, I've just given you a story. We're all very familiar with the story of decline in trust and confidence in the police, and that's very real. But you could flip that round and you could say, well, actually, on most measures, still about 50-60% of people trust the police. And actually, we've been doing a number of surveys over recent years looking at the difference between trust and legitimacy. And Justice will say a bit about the relationship between the two, I think. And legitimacy scores are even higher. So while we have this decline, we still have quite strong residual, might be a word, levels of trust in the police. Well, I think one interpretation of which is that people want to trust the police. People want to grant the police legitimacy, and they actually react very badly when they think there are barriers in the way of them doing that. That's the first proviso. The second proviso is to switch our focus away from London. This tends to be a very London-centric conversation, partly because it's London, partly because it's the Met, and the way that those two things work together, the level of scrutiny in that particular organisation gets compared to others. But then if you look at evidence from the Crime Survey of England and Wales, from HMIC FRS reports, you'll see that the Met is only somewhere in the middle nationally on lots of these measures. There are actually worse performing police organisations than the Met. And we ignore those organisations at our peril, I think, because they're governing most of the country. I think it's interesting that in that regard, that Police Scotland have just released a report in the last few weeks actually owning institutional racism as a term, which is quite unusual for a police organisation. So even north of the border, we have similar problems unfolding. This is not a problem of the Met. This is not an issue with the Metropolitan Police Line. This is a problem of policing in our country as a whole. And to the extent we focus on London, we risk missing the bigger picture. And my last point would be, in some senses, to sum up a lot of what I just said, I think, always in policing and around these kinds of conversations, police are very, very, very prone to do this themselves as well. It's a hunt for the bad apples. All we need to do is find the bad people who are doing bad things and ruining the reputation of our organisation. And once we've weeded those out, then everything will be rosy in the garden. I don't think that's what's going on here at all. These are deep-seated structural issues. There's a political economy around this that we need to understand. And until we understand what the structural issues are, until we understand, for example, the political pressures on police to behave in certain ways that push them in certain directions, then we're never going to be able to address the kind of problem which we're discussing today. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you very much for the invitation. Really pleased to be here. I think the first thing I would say, a couple of points, some of them Ben has already covered, but first of all, what do we mean when we talk about trust in the police? We presume that we have certain shared commitments and that the police will live up to these commitments, whether they are commitments about police responding to our safety concerns, policing trying to create conditions that would allow us to pursue whatever goals that we want to pursue in safety and so forth, that we'll be able to use public spaces, for example, and so forth. And so in a sense, when we place our trust in them, we're making ourselves vulnerable, as some have said. And so there's an element of risk-taking. I think that's crucial because in a sense, you can talk about some people whose default setting, as it were, is to trust the police because these shared commitments that I'm talking about in their daily experiences, in the stories that their friends, their families tell them historically and also now. It reinforces an image of a police force that, for example, is not discriminatory, that responds to their safety needs and so forth. But of course, there are also others whose default setting is not to trust the police. Because, again, of stories, of experiences. So if you can go all the way back to Stephen Lawrence, Mark Dugan, and others, and that creates, in that sense, distrust becomes almost like a matter of survival strategy. Because in the everyday interactions that you have with the police, there's an element of unpredictability in it. You're not too sure whether you're going to be shot or not. You're not too sure whether in the police officers turning up to your home to do a search, whether, for example, evidence is going to be planted in your home or during traffic encounters and so forth. And we see that, of course, that can be costly, even to minority communities, because it means, for example, that when they are arrested for an offense, they know that indeed they have committed the offense. They are less likely to plead guilty very early on because they don't trust the police, that pleading guilty will somehow lead to some reductions in the sentences that they get. They don't even trust legal aid, that their intentions are pure, as it were, and that they are on their side. So again, it can be a survival strategy, but can also be costly in that sense. The second, I think probably for that reason, we need to understand that distrust has a history. And it's a history that cannot simply be written off by some short-term interventions. We need to invest in building trust and having the self-control to allow time for the dividends to be harnessed, as it were. The second thing to say then, and that relates to the point that Ben was making, that yes, these scandals do have a trust cost, but they also reveal to us how fragile trust has been all along. Because yes, a scandal might lead to quite drastic reductions in trust, but as I think the philosopher Honora O'Neill has said, people don't just withdraw trust as if they are rejecting a theory in the face of decisive evidence. There has to be some history leading up to this. And I think what we need then is to think about how we might move from this trust fragility to a situation where police design systems that are learning systems, that can learn from relatively minor mistakes. So some have talked about creating anti-fragile systems, systems that actually learn from those little mistakes. And that requires us to think about, I think, police complaints differently. Currently, if you look at the way police approach complaints, it tends to be legalistic. Here is a complaint. Has the officer violated any rule? No. Case closed. And so when you look at the proportion of cases that are sustained, in some cases, I had a student who looked into complaints against counterterrorism officers, 1% of cases that are upheld. But these cases could be signaling legitimacy concerns that people have. They could be signaling to police officers areas of policing that people thought the police could do better. So can we use that data not just as in terms of an administrative resource, as it were, to try to train police officers to look out for or to make changes that will address some of those concerns. So how can we do that? How can we move policing from a situation where it's purely reactive and legalistic in the way that it handles complaints? I think that also relates to a point that Baroness Casey highlights in her report. And she makes the point that it is unethical for police forces to be hostile to scrutiny. And I agree entirely with her. that you cannot have a police force that is really committed to accountability, to building trust, to improving its performance, that will be at the same time unwilling or even hostile to some external scrutiny. But I think it cannot be that the opposite is what we are looking for, which is that you have a police force that is passive. You want to look into our books? No problem. We're not going to obstruct you, and so forth. I think we need accountability structures that are more proactive, that police forces that consciously, actively seek this so-called outside view, invite external scrutiny, for people to look into how police investigate various offenses, how they respond to complaints, and so forth. And that, of course, also relates to a point that Ben was making, which is that for such credible accountability systems, we need to move away from this idea that police misconduct can be explained in terms of some bad apples theory, and that the issues are not institutional, and so forth. And I think it's partly, this partly arises from, I think, a certain misunderstanding. When we talk about institutional racism, we are not talking in terms of, if you like, statistical distribution, in the sense that 99% of the officers are racist, and so forth. That's not I don't think that's what we're talking about. We are talking about where do we locate the cause of the misconduct. Is it that we locate it entirely in individual police officers, or we say that the way that policing is structured, the way that policing is organized, the kind of cultures that we find within police organizations make misconduct possible? And I think that's always been the understanding when we talk about institutional racism, that it's about where do we locate the cause. Is misconduct an individual problem, or it's an institutional issue? Of course, it is both. If you have no police force can be so effective that it will prevent every potentially corrupt officer from joining. It's not possible. What systems have we put in place to ensure that life is uncomfortable for officers who want to engage in misconduct? And that means focusing on supervision. That means investing in training. That means building better accountability structures. So, for example, Baroness Casey tells us that it takes the Met 400 days to investigate a complaint. That surely doesn't suggest that this is a police force that is committed to issues of ethics and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you. It's so fantastic to be in York and be part of this panel. The discussion sort of so far, I think, has reminded me of an old movie called Liar, Liar, which Jim Carrey plays a lawyer who never tells the truth. So naturally, one of my heroes. And there's a scene in it when he's got this client that repeatedly comes back after robbing a bank, and after the sort of fifth or sixth time this happened, his assistant says, you know, Mr. Whatever is on the phone for you. He's robbed another bank and he'd like your legal advice. And Jim Carrey picks up the phone and he goes, "You want my legal advice? Stop breaking the law, asshole." And I feel like the reason I mention this is I think there's a real danger when talking about perception of the police that we get focused on perception rather than what's at the root of that perception. And the root is that the police are behaving in a problematic manner. It's people, and I think there are incredibly interesting things to be said about how that we're discovering about that a little bit more, because I don't imagine that in the 19th century, when trust in the police was incredibly high, every police officer was a shining example of probity. But at the very root of this is the problematic behaviour of police forces. And as an example of that, I want to sort of pick up a story that we've been telling for along the panel of the Clapham Common matter. And you've heard about what started it all with the murder of Sarah Everard by a serving Metropolitan Police officer. After that happened, the Met advised women living in the local area that the way to avoid getting murdered or harmed was to stay inside more. And so the Met really placed the responsibility for protecting themselves right back onto mostly young women. And this didn't sit too well with the local community. And so a group called Reclaim These Streets organised a vigil on Clapham Common, both for a community to kind of come together and share in its grief and share in its horror. And I was part of that community. I live near Clapham Common, and I can't really express what it felt like at the time. But it was also for women to say, no, it's not on us to stay indoors. We have as much right to be out here as everyone else. And the group that was organising this was a group that was incredibly experienced at organising events. If you know Clapham at all, every other person works in PR or event management. So it's a hotbed for that. And they had a plan in place, even though this was locked down, to have a COVID-safe, socially distanced event, to the extent that they'd worked out where to put speakers on different trees so that someone could make a speech from the bandstand and everyone could be socially distanced and hear it all. And weeks in advance, they contacted Lambeth Police and said, this is our plan, this is what we'd like to do, we're giving you the heads up, we'd like your assistance. And Lambeth Police said, that doesn't really seem like it's going to be a problem. And then the next day, Met Central got back in touch and said, no, that's against lockdown restrictions. And Reclaim These Streets said, why? And the Met said, oh, we're not going to tell you. And this went back and forth for a bit until Reclaim These Streets JR'd the Met, brought an emergency judicial challenge to that decision. And at the door of the court, the Met said, oh, when we said that wasn't allowed, we didn't mean it. Actually, no, we accept your view of the law. And so this JR doesn't need to continue. And the judge said, well, it looks like the Met have changed their position, so there's no need for me to grant an injunction. And the Met came out of that hearing and said, oh, we won. And on the judge's suggestion, they had another conversation with Reclaim These Streets. And during the middle of that conversation, the Met put out another press release saying, if anyone attends this vigil, they'll be liable to arrest. They'll be breaking the law. And they not only threatened to arrest Reclaim These Streets and fine them, but to do so under a provision of law that is intended to address organised crime. Unsurprisingly, given the national outpouring of grief, there was still a vigil. People still showed up, but it was disorganised. It wasn't socially distanced. No one was running things. No one was organising it. And the police, in an operation called Operation Pima, said, well, first we're going to proceed on the basis that the COVID regulations ban all public gatherings, which was legally wrong. Second, because this is disorganised, we consider it unsafe, so we're going to shut it down. And they shut it down with quite extreme prejudice. People that were there described almost like a light switch. When darkness came, the female police officers that had been on duty until then were replaced by almost exclusively male police officers who shoved their way through, trampled the floral tributes to Sarah, and dragged people away. Now, you might expect there to be some sort of investigation of this, and there was. It was an investigation by Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary, which very swiftly not only completely exonerated the Met from any wrongdoing, but launched an extraordinary attack on those who had criticised the Met in public. And And it occurred to myself and a number of others that this was a bit strange and that perhaps the depths of this had not been properly plumbed. And so we set up a parliamentary inquiry. And the first thing we did as part of that parliamentary inquiry was to read the HMIC investigation. And I read it and I thought, there's something missing here. And the thing that was missing was any evidence from anyone who was actually at the vigil. And HMIC had only taken evidence from police and politicians and senior Met staff. And when we held the inquiry in Parliament, when we took evidence, we found that the police had not only misinterpreted the law in a big way, they had ignored a right that has existed in English law since at least the Peterloo massacre, which is the right to protest. And that right has been taken from English law and put into human rights law. And the police had almost entirely disregarded this right in their interpretation of the COVID rules, but also they advocated an entirely wrong interpretation of the law, which is they thought the police don't have an obligation to facilitate protest, whereas it is well established in human rights law that the job of the state in relation to protest is not only to not violently shut it down, it is to actively facilitate peaceful protest, because peaceful protest is a fundamental part of a democracy. And it was exposed that the police had not only got the law wrong, but also arguably assaulted a number of people in doing so. And I think there's 3 points that come out of this. And the first is actually not the fault of the Met. The first, I think, is the fault of the government and Parliament, which is to put police in an impossible position. You mentioned the PCSC Act and the Public Order Act. What these do is give police incredibly broad powers to shut down protests. But they don't give really any sort of guidance about when and how those powers should be exercised. So which puts the police in the position of having to make a political choice. Are we going to tolerate this protest rather than that protest? What flows from this is that the police, having been put in this difficult position, have used their power in a way that certainly appears to be less than even-handed. You mentioned the Spy Cops investigation that's going on. An interesting stat from that is I think there's about 246 operations it's covering. Of those, 5 were involved infiltration of far-right groups. And these are groups which have been proven and have to cause violence. The rest were predominantly left-wing groups, which did not have a history of violence. We've seen the same in London at the moment, where you have far-right groups which picket drag story time, apparently on the assumption that this is something new and has not been part of pantomime for the past 200-odd years. Now, these groups are aggressive, they're invasive, and they're screaming at children. The police have allowed these to continue, despite having this power to impose restrictions on protests that cause serious disturbance. In relation to things like the coronation, however, the police not only imposed those restrictions, but they did exactly the same thing that they did at Clapham Common. Republic talked to the police for a long time beforehand, set out how they would conduct their protest in a way that didn't disrupt the coronation, and the police said, "Thank you very much for telling us where you're going to be. That means it's easier to arrest you," which is exactly what they did. And so there seems to be a lack of even-handedness here. Following on from that is certainly a lack of accountability, and I think it's interesting that you mentioned FOI, and I've got some good police FOI stories from cases that we can maybe get onto. But one thing that repeatedly comes out in FOI cases is that tribunals find that it is not in the public interest to hear bad things about the police, because that might cause us to lose confidence in the police. And this seems to me to get things completely the wrong way around, in that confidence in a public body comes from accountability, not from secrecy and being denied the truth about what's going on. At HMIC's complete failure in Clapham Common is another example of lack of police accountability. So I'll wrap up there. What can we do about this? Well, two things. Number one is clarity. It should not be beyond the wit of politicians to say what they want the police to do with their new powers. And in fact, the APPG that I advised proposed a statutory code for the policing of protest that was achieved cross-party support in Parliament, and so was naturally immediately shot down by the government whips and wasn't given a vote. But this is an important first step. Second, you need genuine independent scrutiny of the police. It's not okay that if you have a problem with the police, a complaint against the police, the only people you can go to are the police themselves. It should not be a shock that people don't want to use those mechanisms, even if they were effective. And I realise we've been quite Met-centric here, but I'm not sure either of these things can really go ahead, and it can really work if the Met continues in its same structure. And we need to also have a talk about whether we restructure the Met completely.
Thank you. Great. Yeah, thanks very much for such really interesting comments and experience, from your own work. So I think everybody really enjoyed that from the kind of rapt attention in the room. So I suppose one thing I kind of wanted to ask before we open it up to a broader discussion is, do you think, say this kind of for everybody really, do you think there's really kind of an underlying tension here that we won't ever really be able to resolve, say between the functions of the police and the society's response to the police? Is the reason why we keep on having these scandals and having these things come over and over again, part of the kind of public scrutiny that we need to have on the police for this institution to sort of respond to the public in the way that it should? What do you think?
I think it's inevitable. Robert Rhino always talks about the police as being the Janus-faced institution. They protect our freedom and they threaten our freedom, and they protect our freedom by threatening our freedom. Mm-hmm. And these are just irresolvable tensions, and they can only just be managed more or less appropriately. Mm-hmm. I don't know if anyone's phone was blinking just now, but I just saw that Nicola Sturgeon's been arrested in Scotland. And so one way of thinking about that is, in some senses, there's no political pressure, as I'm aware, of the Police Scotland to be doing that. I might be wrong, but as far as I'm aware, there's no political pressure on them to be doing that. So in some senses, we should think ourselves lucky that we live in a country where powerful politicians are treated in that way by an independent police organisation. That's what we should be, who knows what's going on there, but that's kind of what we should be aspiring to. But yet, we get all these problems along the way, and they can be managed much, much, much better than they are.
I mean, the Nicola Sturgeon thing, the numbers that they had for that search were more than you would have in a murder investigation.
They might have gone a bit over the top, but nevertheless.
Was that real? You have to wonder whether that was a completely politically neutral investigation. Yeah. I mean, it may just be that everyone was like, oh, this sounds a bit interesting, we'll all show up.
Mm-hmm. And then, do we have any sort of suggestions for solutions to this problem of transparency as well? Do we think that, say, there should be more widely available public data about what the police are doing? Or do you think that the police, say, maybe have a legitimate interest in keeping some of what they do away from public scrutiny?
I mean, I think there 100% needs to be greater public data. Stopwatch, which is a police monitoring group, and crucially not the police, have just published this really great dashboard for stop and search where you can look at which forces are using stop and search the most. I mean, tools like that are so important so that members of the public can hold the police to account, because you can't just say rely on journalists to do that. And I think also, going back to a point I made earlier, there has been recently a huge amount of reporting on the police and a fair amount of political scrutiny as well. The police do also need to do a bit of work themselves now and really look into what is going on, what are the root causes, because we don't really want to be in a cycle where it's an investigation gets published, there's public outrage, and then it just happens again.
I think, yes, certainly transparency is a great thing, but you can be transparent and still hold on to whatever problems that there might be. So we need to be concerned about how the data are produced, who is in charge of that, what is it that is disclosed, under what circumstances, how are that data used, and so forth. I think of course, a very minimalist approach would be, okay, provide us information, that's good, that's transparent, but I think transparency has to be of a certain quality in order to be able to cure distrust or build trust.
I think part of this goes beyond the police, actually, and there's a real distrust of citizens in the institutions of government in the UK don't trust citizens with information. An example from the police, it wasn't my case, I just read it. Someone asked for, who was writing a book, asked for police records relating to investigation into a series of murders in Whitechapel at the turn of the last but one century. And the police relied on an exemption that you use for ongoing investigations. So according to the Met, they're still investigating Jack the Ripper. That's just one of the many examples of just absurd reasons that have been given in FOI cases for not sharing information. And what it comes down to is that we as citizens are not trusted by the government, and to a certain extent, that sort of way of thinking permeates our court system as well, that we can't be trusted with sensitive information because we might be silly about it. And I think that's a fundamental problem with the way we interact with police, but also with across government.
Great. And then one last question for me before we open it up to the audience. So we've heard a bit about the scandals that have engulfed the Met Police and say the conclusions of the Casey report that the Met was institutionally racist, homophobic and misogynistic. And so I was wondering, do you think we need to really completely start from scratch with the police force like that? There are other examples, say like the Police Service of Northern Ireland, they basically disbanded the Royal Ulster Constabulary and created a whole new police force. Do you think that's something that maybe could be a solution to these types of problems?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, would it work? Might we still find, how do we keep the bad apples from infiltrating the new organisation, in inverted commas?
I mean, I think it would be great if we could imagine a PSNI-like reformation of the Met. I mean, currently I can't imagine that. I think that's politically extraordinarily unlikely. But that would start with taking all the national functions away from it and making it a territorial force like all the others, and therefore, by definition, having a national police organisation that does all the national stuff. But that's not going to happen under any reasonable set of expectations, I don't think.
I mean, all police systems are built on particular, if you like, ideologies and ethos and so forth. So, of course, if you are reconstructing a police force and you're trying to get at those, if you like, ideologies that underpin policing, that will help. But if you're merely creating another structure, you have rules, you have procedures, but you don't have mechanisms in place to translate that into practice, you're just in for another round if you like, pulling down the structure and building again. So the issue has to do in part, how can we create institutions that are so, again, self-disciplined, self-critical, that they're committed to the kind of integrity that Casey is talking about, whether through systems that they build internally or through external mechanisms that themselves are sufficiently independent and able to be able to support policing. I think that's what we need. Yeah.
And it's definitely not for me to say what should happen to the Met, but I think it's worth remembering, as has been brought up, that it's not just the Met. You know, I talked about, it was Cumbria that was the most disproportionate with the lockdown fines. Avon and Somerset was also quite bad. Greater Manchester Police was and possibly still is in special measures because of how poor it was being in terms of, I think, recording data and handling cases. And I think often the data shows when you look at ethnic disproportionality, it's not always the Met that is the worst. Often some of the rural forces can be extremely poor. And yeah, I think it's important we don't get too fixated on the Met. I mean, it's all police forces need to come under scrutiny, but the challenge is, as I mentioned earlier, how do you cross-compare? How do you look at them as a whole?
Yeah, great. So I think we'll open it up then to the audience. So if you'd like to raise your hand if you have a question, and then we have the roving mic. So I think your hand was up first. We'll take you first, and then we'll take you second.
You referred to the improvement in confidence in the police under the Blair government, which obviously was linked to the introduction of neighbourhood policing in particular. Was that the sole factor? Was the confidence justified? And are there lessons from that in terms of what ought to be done now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think probably yes, neighbourhood policing was important. Yes, increases in budgets that increased visibility and allowed all that kind of stuff to happen. Probably by the 2000s, people actually kind of, some sense, noticed that crime actually had been falling for 10 or 15 years, and that started to kind of percolate through people's opinions and mindsets. So I think all these things come together. I mean, the changes that we see over time from say, that period to then, they've always got multiple causes, and it's very difficult to pin down a particular set of things that cause it. I mean, the other important thing to note is you know, the work that I do and a lot of academic work in this field, justice as well to an extent, we're looking at people's opinions of policing. And that's what we're measuring in these surveys and so forth. And often, if it's a general population survey, the large number of people, the majority of people in that survey know nothing about policing. They haven't had any recent contact with police. They're inferring their trust, they're inferring their legitimacy judgments from other stuff around them. And the way that they think about policing can actually be quite, I wouldn't say untethered, but there's lots in between what they think about policing and the way that policing actually is. So we would never want to be relying totally on some national level measure of opinion. That's just one part of a much bigger picture.
Can I ask you a question on that? How much are opinions of policing affected by things other than actual policing? Because obviously, you know, police, there's hundreds of TV programmes where police are the heroes. We've got a media, the tabloid media, that sort of venerates the police a lot of the time. How much are opinions or views of the police based on kind of this external culture rather than what's actually happening in reality?
Yeah. The biggest predictors in order is personal experience. That is the most important, and lots of people do have personal experience of policing. Vicarious experience is also really important. So the stories you hear about policing from your friends and family, not necessarily from the media, but from people you know who tell you things. And then the third, and it's really, really important, is what we tend to call something like antisocial behaviour, but it's not really that. It's low-level disorder. So it's things like dog mess, and put bluntly, and litter, and graffiti, and these kinds of things. And people who live in those kinds of areas, and equally importantly, people who think they live in those kinds of areas, people perceive this, they tend to have much lower levels of trust in the police. And then only after those, and some way down the list, is actually crime and other stuff.
I think it's just a small point to that. And it's also the case that there's a lot about the drivers of confidence that we still don't understand. Because even when you look at the best of the evidence, we are only able to explain a very small proportion of the variations in people's confidence. There's a lot out there that we don't understand because it's always quite difficult to measure all the possible determinants or predictors of confidence. So that's quite a challenge, yeah.
Great. So we'll take this gentleman over here, yeah.
To the best of my knowledge, the IOPC have yet to pronounce on the child Q case. In any event, all their investigations seem to be glacial, to put it mildly. Is the IOPC fit for purpose? Is it part of the problem?
Are you saying the IOPC?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I feel like that might be a question for maybe one of the academics rather than for me.
Well, I think it has its challenges. When it was IPCC, the Parliamentary Select Committee detailed to us a number of these challenges, including the fact that we've got a number of police officers who are working with or for this organization. We have seen that some people who have lodged complaints have raised concerns about the way that it responds to these complaints, especially complaints from ethnic minorities and so forth. But I think ultimately accountability has to be probably internal, as some have said, because it's not possible to have an external mechanism that is able to check everything that the police do. How do they investigate certain crimes? How do they record things? What kind of supervision arrangements are there? How are officers exercising their discretion? These are things that to me, it's impossible to have that done by an external organization. The external mechanisms should be there, as of course they are supposed to be a supervisory kind of thing, checking to make sure that the internal systems are working. I think if we place too much emphasis on the external, and police forces might just renege on their responsibility, that, well, to the extent that the external hasn't seen this, hasn't said anything about it, we just plow on as business as usual. So I think we need to invest in strengthening internal mechanisms and having the externals just as a, if you like, supplement or complement, probably a supplement. That's what I would say.
Great. There's kind of an analogy between, kind of why people follow the law themselves as well. So the idea that you need to have a police force policing the police, kind of seems to miss the point a bit that the police need to police themselves in order, to keep that integrity.
Yes, I mean, a lot of the time they police themselves. But of course, we don't want that to be the only thing that is available. We want the external systems. But of course, the external accountability systems we have in England and Wales it's not just the IOPC, as is mentioned already. We've got the inspectorate, which is also helping on how police might improve their performance, their investigation of various things. Those two arrangements are really, in my mind, fantastic to have institutions that are on the one hand dealing with individual serious cases of misconduct, but you also have another institution that is more macro, looking at how police use their resources, how they investigate, the scope of improvement and so forth. And then probably in between those, you've got the College of Policing, which is also trying to inject more evidence into policing. And I think if you take that picture, it seems, I think, a great arrangement. Yeah.
I think on HMIC, which is obviously the one I know more about, we had some really worrying bits of evidence in the come out in the inquiry about HMIC, and Lord Paddock, not to be confused with Lord Panic. Lord Paddock is a former senior Met officer, gave evidence to the inquiry, and he was talking about HMIC whistleblowers. And so, for example, the HMIC was a big supporter of the PCSC bill and wrote a very supportive report. But a whistleblower said that the leadership of HMIC informed the Home Secretary that they were going to write a supportive report before they did the work. And so that report was essentially just a piece of political advocacy rather than a piece of doing what HMIC is supposed to do. And obviously their investigation in Clapham Common was hugely problematic. And I think if you get two things like that wrong in such a close period of time, certainly that's at least a sort of prima facie case to start digging into what else they've got wrong and whether there's something deeper going on.
Right, so we'll take a question from the gentleman at the back there.
At force level, I wonder what we know about what works best in terms of quality policing, in terms of the governance model at force level. I remember that we had police committees and they were replaced by police and crime commissioners. I heard you mention the reform of police services in Northern Ireland as an exemplar, about which I know nothing, but I'll know a lot more when I've gone away and investigated that later. So I wonder if there's a governance model there at force level which helps to know what is the most effective means of holding individual police forces to account. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there was a view, not only shared by the Cameron-Clegg government, but also others, that police and crime commissioners would be actually a good opportunity. Strange though the reform was, because we don't organise anything else like that in this country, so why just policing? But there was an opportunity to provide genuine democracy, inject genuine democracy into the governance of local forces, because the structures, the tripartite system that existed before wasn't delivering. I mean, I don't think that's what's happened. I think that most police and crime commissioners have been essentially captured by the police, and end up just acting as another arm of an existing institutional framework in local force areas. What you do about that now, I've gotten that's above my pay grade. I mean, the bigger question is, if you were starting with a blank piece of paper, would you organise policing as it is organised in England? Well, no, of course you wouldn't. I mean, it's ridiculous to have 43 geographically based police organisations, plus British Transport Police, plus the City of London, and they wanted 43, and then they're met with some national function. It's just ridiculous. But we're never... any efforts to do anything about that are always utterly stymied by local opposition. People want their own police force. So where you go from there, I've got no sense. But I think probably, for what it's worth, I would want to go back, give it back to local government, and have some level of reorganisation of local government as well that matched police organisations, because they don't match, of course, which is what police and crime commissioners were meant to do. And in London, to an extent, perhaps in Manchester, the relatives, perhaps particularly Manchester, you can do it at that level. You can get local government organisations mapped onto police organisations, and perhaps when that happens, there's a greater opportunity.
I mean, those West Mercians that haven't been recognised as a region since 1066, yet they still have a police force. I think the police and crime commissioners seem to be sort of a democratic reform designed by someone who's read one tweet on democracy and nothing else. Because it's the idea that so long as you vote on something every 4 years or so, that's democracy. And what they've actually done is just taken a committee and replaced it with one unaccountable individual who occasionally is re-elected in an election that 2.5 people vote in. And it's ironically had, I think, the complete opposite effect. And it goes back to saying, if you want to do democratic reform, have a think about what democracy is a bit more deeply than do I rock up and vote now and again, and think about accountability. How is the police and crime commissioner themselves held accountable, other than these fairly meaningless one-off elections? And if you've got, for example, some sort of commission, or maybe a local government committee might be a way of going about it, it's much more difficult to institutionally capture 10 people than it is to institutionally capture one, particularly if all of those people are genuinely accountable, not just once every 4 or 5 years, but every day for what they're doing.
I mean, you do, of course, have the NPCC as well, which is, you know, the National Police Chiefs Council. It's there ostensibly to help coordinate policing and to kind of wrangle the 43 forces. But then the issue is, you know, with the coronavirus fines, it was the NPCC that's eventually started publishing the breakdown of the data. They did commission this report into what was going on with the fines, which I mentioned, and it came out in March, and The Guardian wrote about it in May. But the NPCC hasn't published that report. It was published by the uni that did it. It's not, as far as I'm aware, and this is The Guardian's reporting, so blame them, not me. The NPCC didn't publish it on their own website. So there's a real question there about transparency. And I think the body of the NPCC might be, it might have been set up with the hope of kind of creating some form of centralisation. But, you know, another thing the NPCC was supposed to do is come up with a race action plan, which it has done. But then the BBC had an article that staff of colour who were on the action plan had been excluded from it. And one black member of staff said they'd been told, we don't see why black people need to feed into this. So if that's what's coming from the centralised body, then obviously that suggests there's an issue.
I think, sorry, just a quick comment. Yeah. We've seen in a couple of days now the HMIC talking about having a role in the appointment of crime commissioners, which is I mean, they've been doing the investigations, they've been inspecting these forces, they've been looking at the relationship. And I think the fact that they want to go back to having a say in terms of the appointment of police chiefs, because there's some suspicion there that there seems to be some scratch your back, I scratch your back kind of situation. I think that's instructive. Yeah.
Isn't that really compounding the problem, though? Because you've got the body that is supposed to be holding them accountable is also involved in the appointment process. If they're involved in a decision-making capacity, they've suddenly got an interest in the person they've appointed, who at the same time they're supposed to be disinterestedly holding to account. It sort of just webs the web even further.
I think the role they foresee is being able to exercise some kind of veto in a situation where this individual is really not fit for the job.
But what if the individual is a critic of HMIC? Which then there are a lot of people that may be running for police and crime commissioner who are not least Lord Paddock, who are saying HMIC is doing a rubbish job.
Indeed.
And now are they? How is HMIC? How is that circle going to get squared?
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've got two questions here, and then there's two in the middle. So if we take these two here together, and then we'll take the two in the middle after that. So Matt was first, and then it was the lady here.
Sorry, I try to stay quiet because I speak a lot, but I have to put a plug in for the fact that we have a centre here for policing and vulnerability, and the reason I raise that is because my question is really, do we ask too much of the police, and do we know what we want from them? Because we have a centre for policing and vulnerability, because if you have charges, and I have had, you have charges over students who have, for example, mental health crises, you're told, well, look, if the crisis team is not available, ring the police. So the police, as we've just seen from the Met Commissioner, are spending a lot of time as first responders to mental health and vulnerability issues. Other people want them to solve crimes, but if we want them to solve crimes, they use evidence-led policing. Community policing is not generally supported by evidence-led policing. So then people come along and say, well, don't worry about solving crimes, worry about visibility and PCs on the beat. So, okay, so we want visibility, we want solving crimes, but those two things don't go together. We want them somehow to be responding to vulnerability and mental health issues. I'm sure Sam's right. A large proportion of the population will want them to facilitate protest, and some proportion of the population, I don't agree with them, will think the police should be there to stop them disrupting this national celebration of the coronation. So, I mean, just because we've been very critical, just to, in a sense, not so much stand up for the police, but just empathise or sympathise with them. I mean, it does seem to me that we've put this institution into an almost impossible position, and is perhaps some of the problems that have arisen because they can't satisfy everyone all the time, but that's because you just can't satisfy everyone all the time if you're given different things that you need to do and those things don't fit together.
So let's take the other question and then we'll take them together, so respond together. Thanks.
My question is regarding this idea of the perfect victim. particularly in cases of sexual assault. Firstly, how can we address the police's perception of what the perfect victim looks like? And how can we ensure that the voices of people who don't fit this ideal are heard, like people who don't necessarily have the blonde hair, blue eyes, and other victims who, like Sarah Everard, were murdered but didn't get the same level of outrage?
Great. So both questions, whoever wants to respond.
I think the answer to both is actually the same, and the answer is cash. So taking them one at a time, the police, you're absolutely right. The police are asked to do a huge swathe of duties that should be taken on by other arms of the state. But those other institutions have also been cut to the bone over the last 10 to 15 years. And so we've been suffering a mental health crisis as a nation for getting on for 5 years now, and that's I think probably much longer. It's just we only noticed or had words for it for the last 5 or so years. And this is almost a completely new area of healthcare that's incredibly, well, not new, old area of healthcare, but newly noticed area of healthcare that we just haven't grappled with and haven't built any sort of institution that is capable of fully tackling. And you almost, there's no sort of emergency, the emergency mental health care too often is a police officer who's got no training in it. So it's, the police, it's a mistake, I think, to kind of see the police in isolation. They should be working as part of a network that is designed to address society's problems. And part of the issue is that they're too often used, rather than addressing society's problems, as a way to, fight a culture war or win a vote. Moving on to the reason I say cash in relation to your question as well is because part of the inherent problems with the way we do policing is who we're recruiting and how we're training them. And policing is a relatively low-paid profession and a relatively low-respected profession internally. The conditions are not the worst, but they're not fantastic. And as a result, there's a real danger that what you're doing is attracting people that just want to exercise the power and can't get a job elsewhere. And these are not the people who are ever going to be able to necessarily even be receptive to training, even if we were giving them the proper training. So if we were to properly invest in the police and invest in the development of officers and recruiting at a higher level, rewarding them more, and as a result of that, expecting them to reach a much higher level of training and a much higher level of understanding of the issues that they're having to address, I'm not saying that would solve the problem you've identified because it's multifaceted, but I think that's a really important step in that direction and certainly a necessary step in that direction.
I agree with all of that. I mean, the 3 additional points. First, I'm glad you mentioned the centre because I'm actually a co-I. So I think I was probably meant to say that. So you reminded me. I mean, one of the things that we're doing as part of the centre's work is some work exploring through focus groups initially where people think the limits of policing are. Where do they think that police involvement in a situation is appropriate? Where do they think it's inappropriate? And people, it turns out people are very, very naturally, intuitively in line with the sociologist Egon Bittner, who said if the police are the police, the organisation you call where something that is happening that shouldn't be is happening and about which someone had better do something now. So they want police emergency response to situations where the state needs to respond, and they're very happy with that. And they're quite relatively relaxed about actually, the other bit of that is that they use force to solve those problems. People say, because sometimes you need to use force to solve problems. But what they also then say very clearly is then those problems should be given to other institutions, which is exactly that point. The second thing I was going to say is more in relation to the kind of the perfect victim argument. I mean, and this taps into similar kind of argument. We shouldn't just beat up the police. So policing in this country is, orders of magnitude better than policing in the 1950s and 60s, which was awful. It was corrupt, racist, misogynist, homophobic, I mean, even by the standards of the time, it was all those things. How has it improved? It's improved by the kinds of things that we've been talking about, so massively increased transparency, surveillance, press reporting, dragging these organisations into the 20th and then the 21st century. And in relation specifically to your question, the increasing diversity within the police organisation will be part of that, has been part of that. So by international standards, UK policing has got a very high representation of women, for example, 30 to 40% in most forces, which is way more than most police organisations in the world. But that's not enough. It's not enough to get women or ethnic minorities into police. Right? It's your responsibility to solve our problems, really, just by dint of who you are. So that's weird. You need to have all those other things in place to kind of enable those people within the organisation to change its culture. And it's changing the culture of the organisation by the things that we've been talking about, which has made things better and could make things better in the future. But what it needs is the political will to spend the money on the kinds of things we've been talking about. And I'm not at all clear that the political will exists at the moment.
Great. So I'll just take 2 more questions and then we'll wrap up. So there are 2 questions here, so if you want to take them together again, and then we'll respond.
So building on Sam's cash point, but picking up on Ben's much earlier point about the police effectiveness in terms of their ability to withstand austerity and budget cuts. Is there any merit in considering something that looks at the effectiveness of budget and resource deployment set against public opinion? So I was very struck by your burglary issue, that lots of resources are now going to be turning up at multiple houses, but probably are not going to be able to solve anything. Do we need something the equivalent of NICE and their relationship with the NHS to help the police force consider how better they can use the budgets they've got to be more effective, and particularly in relation to Marin's point about data?
Great. And then that one, yeah.
So due to today's day and age, there's more of a media saturation, and that can create politically biased opinions. So especially for the youth, how can the education system and government policies promote a positive perspective on these policing agencies, or do the police need to act more to even begin this idea?
Great. Marin, so yeah.
It was more on the last 2 questions, so I hope you'll forgive me for kind of answering them, but I think it might also touch on your question. I appreciate your question was much broader about are we asking too much of the police, but I do feel like the main issue at the moment is about police disproportionality and police racism. And again, I know this isn't really what you were driving at, but it does feel like it will never be asking too much to say treat people fairly and equally, because at the most extreme end of policing, you have to remember that they have the power to use violence against you. They can set dogs on you, they can taser you, they can literally punch you in the face. That's one of the things they can do. And people die at their hands. So that issue has to be tackled, because we're constantly seeing disproportionality across so many different measures of policing, like I mentioned earlier. And I think on your point about the perfect victim, we know that, unfortunately, that the police have sometimes overlooked black and brown missing women, missing people. And again, that it feels like the same issues are at play there. And certainly as the media, we can and should do more in terms of who we cover and making sure we're not overlooking those people. But that particular issue of disproportionality, which is so in the news at the moment, and I think people are getting rightly exercised and outraged of it, that has to be addressed. And perhaps that also speaks to your point about when we prioritise things, what should we prioritise? And it seems to me like we've got to sort out those really extreme powers, like strip search, like use of force, that are causing so much harm to certain groups.
In response to the question about burglary, I mean, in some senses, that's what the college is meant to do, right? It's kind of meant to fulfil those roles. I think that, in a sense, is still very much a work in progress. I think the issue with those kinds of debates within policing, in particular, is that very quickly they get siphoned off into questions about kind of narrow instrumentalism. So, what is the most effective way we can spend our resource to solve crime and prevent crime? And of course, that has to be part of the discussion or part of the equation you're trying to form. But I think there's something deeper going on here, and it's about the state's responsibility to its citizens. So when people have experienced a crime as invasive as people experience burglary to be, they have, a right is probably not quite the right word when I've got a lawyer sitting on the panel, but they should have a reasonable expectation that agents of the state are going to turn up and look like they care about what's happened to them. And actually, those kinds of things, providing restitution, providing recognition for harm suffered, can go some of the way to putting that harm back right, even before you start getting about how do we do it more effectively and can we get them back their stolen property, etc., etc. So we need to, in policing in particular, I mean, it's true, the same is probably true for healthcare, but in policing in particular, we need to remember the kind of symbolic importance of policing and what it says to people about where they fit in society and their status and their inclusion. And those kinds of things are often lost in those kind of debates, which I think is a real risk.
Great. So I think that's all we have time for then. So thanks very much to the audience. Thanks for coming and thanks for your brilliant questions. And thanks so much to our speakers, bringing all of your insights. And it's been a really, really interesting session. So just give a round of applause to the speakers.